Patrick Taran, it's good to have you on this panel. And I remember the last time that we were on the same panel. Patrick is the president for the Global Migration Policy Association. Women's rights and the power to create change. What's your reflection on this issue?
Well, thank you. And let me add just a few words about the challenges we face and some ideas of the way forward. And I will try to be mercifully brief, given the hour. The content and the outcome of the Beijing Fourth World Conference on Women was fundamentally about articulating the values, rights, and dignity of women and girls, and about realizing those rights and values in reality. It was, or I should say it is, about universalizing human rights and protections. However, that generally requires the force of law and policy to realize, and therefore collaboration with states. Maybe better said, though, the agenda here is to support the actors, the subjects, to own and realize themselves, yourselves, rights, peace, and well-being. The agenda is certainly about advancing the definition of women as full and equal participants in community, society, and nation, albeit also in family, with the authority and power of self-determination that requires. The agenda is about the capacity, the competence, and as Ursula reminded us earlier, about the expertise to participate and contribute fully in social, economic, cultural, civil, and political arenas. But today, we are facing huge challenges. The recognition, the gains, the progress achieved in Beijing 20 years ago are not only contested, but they're being pushed back, as was amply described by earlier panelists. The very legitimacy of the Declaration and Program of Action of Beijing is being discredited, dismissed, and in some cases, explicitly rejected. If we're going to keep what we have, we need to uphold the validity of what was achieved 20 years ago and to uphold its truths that we hold to be self-evident. We must know what we want and where we're going, because here what we're about is figuring out how to get there, and on increasingly rough terrain. What the next 2 days are about is reaffirming that the Beijing Platform of Action, the Declaration, is not only eminently relevant today, but applies all the more so to women and groups of women and girls, some of whom were not addressed in Beijing. Aging women, migrants and refugees, and men and boys. Let me remind that the Beijing Declaration was also explicitly about equality, development, and peace. It was about acknowledging the voices and participation of women and girls. And as stated in the very first paragraphs, it was about the commitment to equal rights and inherent dignity of all women and girls, and enjoyment by women and girls of all fundamental rights and freedoms, and elimination of all forms of discrimination. This and much else was the vision of our common future, what it should be, that was articulated 20 years ago. That visionary statement of values was also translated into real action, real guidelines for what needs to be done to realize that agenda. But this entire agenda is threatened, not only by direct confrontation, but by the consequences of what I call 5 global crises. Laszlo, it might be worse than you expressed. These mega trends are shaping or misshaping the world we live in. We have to take into account these crises, these conditions, if we're to make any further progress in realizing the vision and the dream of what the Beijing World Conference on Women articulated. First of all, and it was amply described already, we have a crisis of unemployment and impoverishment that particularly impacts on women. Women face exclusion from decent employment, they have restricted access to labor markets, they're often confined to exploitative and unprotected jobs, and they're obliged to assume increasing burdens of the unpaid labor for the so-called social reproduction, the family, child raising, and care for the aged. Malinka articulated some of the details in the second panel. Second, we have a crisis of social disintegration. a polarization of wealth and power on the one side versus exclusion from the very means to survival for many women. We have disintegration of social protection even where it existed. And we have disintegration of any notion or reality of social justice, of justice itself. It's as if we're going not to the future, but we're going back to the 19th century with its extremes of concentrated wealth and generalized mass poverty, particularly, of course, affecting women and girls. We have a crisis of values, and here I want to underline the importance of looking at this as a question of values, not just of material situations. And it's driven by and driving an explicit assault on human rights that are today posed as neither universal, nor inalienable, nor indivisible, and not even relevant or applicable. As we've seen recently, the idea of a resolution in the Human Rights Council on the right to peace. Well, there is no right to peace. That's not a right. Is there a right to development? No. Do we have a right to development? Listen to the rhetoric. At the same time, we have a prevalent discourse in the media, in our societies, in the discourse even of leaders and public opinion figures, that wealth that people have is merited, and that poverty, if people are poverty, that's what they deserve. In other words, what we're finding is an evolution of the war on poverty into a war against the poor, and effectively a war against women. Fourthly, a crisis of participation. Where are the organizations, the mass organizations in which many people and many women participated in the last decades? Trade unions, political parties, coalitions. They are no longer such mass organizations. And there is a crisis both of multilateralism and certainly of governance, both at national and international levels. My time doesn't permit me to elaborate on that, but I just want to sum up by saying all 5 of these are overarching crises that are a clear danger to the welfare, the well-being, the participation, and the protection of rights and dignity of all women and girls. So what do we need to do here and now? I sum up with 5 quick points. First of all, we need to take the ideological initiative, reassert that the values we're defending are universal values, rights, equality, participation. They are or should be our core values, what we are about and why we are here. Secondly, we need to reiterate that those values and what was achieved at Beijing is validated, is seen as valid, and is applicable today, not only to those who are articulated and described in the Beijing Program of Action, but other women, indigenous women, migrant women, refugee women, aging women, youth, and others, but explicitly. Thirdly, we need to take back the night, and in fact, take back the day, by applying Beijing and the principles, values, standards on which its recommendations are based to today's realities. They are different. We're in a different century than Beijing took place, with new as well as old challenges. Fourthly, we need to participate, and if I can say those 3 words, it's organize, organize, organize. And on that basis, fifthly, look at, we're going to go out and advocate, not just have nice statements, but go out and advocate, work with states, work with popular organizations, work with communities of women to make sure that we get the laws, protections, entitlements, enablements. And to do that, we have to have an irresistible force that's going to move those immovable objects. If we can accomplish that here, we will have made a big step to taking back the night and the day. Thank you.
We are reclaiming the agenda here. That's why we are sitting in the United Nations. Thank you so much for really affirming that, that notion of us reclaiming the threshold